Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Katie Merritt, and I am the policy intern at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing on IATP's website and YouTube channel afterwards. So today we are talking about carbon markets and agriculture, a U.S. and international perspective. It was determined at the NSAC summer meeting of 2014 that our members were interested in learning more on this subject, and this webinar is for educational purposes to allow us to move forward with a policy position on carbon markets in the United States with consideration for the potential of agriculture to play a role in offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. I'm happy to be here today with Renata Brillinger, Executive Director of the California Climate and Agriculture Network, or CalCan, and Ben Lilliston, the Vice President for Programs at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Today they are going to lead us through two presentations on carbon markets, Renata focusing on CalCan's principles within the California carbon market, and Ben will be speaking to how agricultural carbon markets work in international settings. So just to briefly introduce the concept of carbon markets so our speakers can delve into their use in practice, a carbon market is one where emitters are permitted fixed volumes of greenhouse gas emissions in order to incentivize them through either voluntary or mandatory settings to find solutions to lower their emission footprint. Entities that continue to emit above permitted levels have the option to buy offsets from certified individuals engaging in greenhouse gas emission mitigation. For agriculture, there are certified methods that farmers and ranchers can voluntarily engage in, such as reforestation that sequesters carbon in the soil, limiting nitrogen application to reduce nitrous oxide release, or adjusting ruminator diets to produce less methane. Together, this system encourages less reckless greenhouse gas emissions from industry while rewarding agricultural producers that engage in climate-friendly practices. About 20 minutes for questions at the end. You can ask a question by typing in the text box in your control panel, which is located by default on the right of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So with that, let's turn it over to you, Renata.
Hi folks, Renata Brillinger speaking. I hope you can hear me. Pleased to be here today to give you a little bit of a sense of some thinking that we've been doing over the years at CalCan on this subject of carbon markets, and then I'm going to also talk towards the end a little bit about the California program and its particular design and opportunities that we're also working on. Just to give you a little bit of an overview about CalCan itself. I think probably a lot of you are familiar with CalCan, and Jeannie Merrill, our policy director, is our NSAC representative. So I won't dwell on this too long, but we basically were set up about 6 years ago to serve as a voice on our state and federal climate change policy. Most of the activity happens at the state level, unfortunately, but we do engage with NSAC on farm bill issues and conservation programs specifically. So what we're after ultimately is resources that will help growers transition towards agricultural practices that have climate benefits, both for adaptation and mitigation. And we do this by a combination of kind of inside and outside game strategy. We work to develop a network of leaders and partners and allies that can magnify our voice and our reach, that serve as advisors and that sort of serve as a learning community in a way. And then we also do lobbying and work on regulatory issues and legislative issues. And there's a lot to, that I could talk about there. But broadly speaking, we engage primarily in cap and trade implementation, adaptation planning, and clean energy policy. So I'll just direct you to a document that you might want to pull up later, or now for that matter, that's going to basically be the skeleton of what I go through here. It's a pretty short little piece. It's just 3 or 4 pages long, and we developed this in 2012 in consultation with a number of our advisors at the time, because it was the sort of dawn of California's cap and trade program, and we we had some concerns and questions about how well the carbon market would serve our constituents, our stakeholders, organic and sustainable growers around the state. And so we put this piece together, and I'm just going to, it's available there on our website. I'm going to run through the principles that are in it. We got a number of questions ahead of the webinar that I'm hoping, some of which will sort of be implicitly answered as I go through this, but also, encourage people to re-ask their question towards the end if you didn't get it directly answered. And I guess I'll say up front that we've had a sort of skeptical perspective on how well carbon markets will provide opportunities for growers and incentivize practices. And so far, I think a lot of our skepticism has been proved out. We remain open and vigilant, but there's not a whole lot of promise here, at least not today, on the actual carbon market. And I want to make a distinction between the carbon market and other forms of incentives that are available in California. I'll get back to that. So it's really important to understand that all transactions in the carbon market place are bound by some requirements that are summarized here. They're listed here, and these requirements are really important. Actually, I mean, we're in full agreement that these should be the components of an effective cap and trade carbon market. Because as Katie said, we're basically saying to the biggest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions that they can go on and continue to emit these pollutants at a given level, as long as they offset their emissions in some other sector that isn't also regulated. In this case, we're talking about farming being one of those possible sectors. So we really do need to ensure that those transactions are real, that they really are resulting in greenhouse gas reductions, or we've done nothing to solve our climate crisis, and we've enabled the polluters to continue to emit those greenhouse gases. So we agree that these are the right requirements, but you'll see as we keep talking that those requirements actually are very constraining, and in some cases we would argue make it virtually impossible for some growers to benefit. So the protocols that get developed and scrutinized and commented on and revised over time, they guide those transactions, those those sales of carbon credits, and they're required to demonstrate that the greenhouse gas reductions can be verified, that they're measurable, that they're quantifiable, that there's some integrity to it, to the reductions. And then importantly, they have to be additional, and what that means is that the seller of the credits, the entity, the individual, the business who is benefiting financially by selling their credits to a regulated entity, has to testify and demonstrate somehow that they would not have otherwise done this practice. So because after all, we are seeking to reduce the overall emissions globally, so somehow, and it's very difficult to demonstrate what would have happened if not for the payment of this credit, it has to be demonstrated that they're additional. And then finally, and I'll come back to this, but importantly, that leaves out any early adopters and it leaves out all the best actors who are already doing practices that have climate benefits. So that's an important thing, I think for our stakeholders, those of us on the call. And then the last requirement is also very challenging, which is that those reductions in greenhouse gas emissions must be permanent, and permanence in the biological world is a difficult condition to meet, and the protocols have to define what they mean by permanent. Sometimes they have 30 or 40-year contracts that are required, and sometimes it's more like 100 years. It depends on the protocol. So those are the conditions. I'm going to quickly run through some of the principles that we came up with in light of those constraints. The first one we think is critically important, which is that any protocol that gets approved should ideally take a whole farm approach. It's important to us, and we think to organic and sustainable agriculture at large, that we don't get too carbon-centric about this business of solving climate change or responding to climate change, that there are a tremendous number of other co-benefits to be achieved as well, and that taking a whole farm approach is going to be our best opportunity for not only addressing climate change, but also making farms more resilient to the impacts of climate change. Also, reducing problems we have with air and water quality and the health ramifications for communities. We have opportunities to increase the amount of wildlife habitat, which will not only obviously respond to the climate crisis, but also provide more habitat for pollinators and wildlife. So that's a challenge for carbon market protocols. This is just a picture of a fertigation system, which is a practice that conventional agriculture is more and more interested in, and that there's some good research to show will reduce nitrous oxide emissions if we can better time and place, be more precise about nitrogen fertilizer applications. We may indeed see reductions in nitrous oxide emissions, nitrous oxide obviously being a really potent greenhouse gas. However, just focusing on a protocol that, for example, incentivizes fertigation and more precise irrigation management is going to miss some opportunities to actually do truly transformative practices like soil building, replacing nitrogen fertilizers with some alternative inputs. So that's just, there aren't currently any protocols that incentivize nitrogen use reduction, but it is one that's been explored and being worked on, as far as I know. Still people trying to figure this out. Second principle we would say is that we really need to be considerate of the economic and agronomic benefits for farmers. Now this is also a tricky one for the carbon market to be responsive to. The carbon market really cares only about greenhouse gas reductions. It does not seek to, it doesn't concern itself with any other co-benefits or considerations of growers. So it doesn't consider, for example, the economic feasibility. It doesn't consider any kind of co-benefits from, again, from say soil building, where we might see a whole bunch of other benefits to growers, reduced input costs, for example, if they were to transition to an organic system. That kind of thinking and framework doesn't exist in the carbon market. It's really just concerned with greenhouse gas reductions. I touched on this a minute ago about the importance of considering co-benefits. As I keep saying, the carbon market just measures and rewards reductions in methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. So an example I'll give you is a protocol here in California that's been approved and is in use. It's been approved by the California Air Resources Board, the regulatory entity that oversees our cap and trade program. One of the protocols that has been approved, one of only two for agriculture that's been approved to date. Actually, this is the only one. The second one is near approval. This protocol does allow or describe the parameters under which confined animal feeding operations can sell some credits if they install anaerobic digesters on their CAFO. So it pays growers a certain amount of money, whatever the market cost of carbon is per ton, to capture methane in these different kinds of facilities that capture the gas that comes off the animal waste and turns that methane into electricity, sometimes natural gas. So while this is a valid idea in terms of capturing methane, a very potent greenhouse gas, it does nothing to address the other environmental and health issues that particularly in the Central Valley in California, are very severe and linked directly to these kinds of operations. There's a huge air quality problem and many difficult health impacts that come in part from this industry, and the capture of methane doesn't deal with that. It also does, we still have a waste management problem because the biosolids that are produced are still need to be disposed of somehow. So again, not to say this isn't something that has some merits, but it's limited in its impact. This principle we put out is to create a transparent and accountable marketplace. And I just put this little chart up not for us to actually run through and understand, but to give you a sense of the rather burdensome transaction costs and procedures that are involved in participation in any of these sales of credits. There are several different third parties involved. There's often a verifier. They have to be certified by, in this case, by the state of California. And so they insert themselves into this procedure between the grower and the buyer. There's often an aggregator to group together numbers of farmers supposedly to facilitate the transaction, but they're another entity that then profits from their role in these transactions. Sometimes there are brokers. So it's a multi-step process to just get a project approved for under a given protocol. The development of the protocols themselves, there was a question that came in before the webinar about how to go about developing a protocol. That process itself is incredibly intensive, rarely involves growers, usually involves accountants and engineers and these specialists that are now being developing to play roles in creating these protocols, various consultants, and these protocol developments I don't know the actual amount of money it requires to develop one, but it's I think it's safe to say it's in the tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get to the point of having an eligible protocol, and in many cases years of work to do so. There's a rice protocol in California that's nearing approval that's I think been 7 years in the making, maybe longer. And then I guess the other thing I'll say about this, the transparency and accountability related to the transaction costs and the bureaucratic burdens that growers will face is that the price of carbon is still quite low. In California it's hovering around $11 or $12 a ton, and there are all kinds of estimates about what it really needs to be at in order to make a meaningful change, but I think we should be looking for a much higher price of carbon, especially when you consider all the other entities that are involved in getting a project approved and how little the farmer would actually see of that $11 or $12 a ton. Second to last principle here is that the practitioners, farmers and ranchers, should be the beneficiaries of the offset credits. In California, at least, we have a lot of land that's owned not by farmers. There's many leasees that grow land on grow food on other people's land, and so there's a question that comes back to the permanence question. If you don't own your own land, or even if you do, how assured can the state be that you will actually continue to do the practices that you commit to do under contract, and for how long? And even more uncertainty comes into the picture if growers don't actually own the land. That said, because there are so many farmers, especially beginning farmers, especially smaller scale farmers that don't own land, the question then becomes, well, who gets the credit? Who gets paid for that, for those practices? And we maintain that it should be the farmers. And this question actually probably gets addressed on a case-by-case basis with, in the development of the protocols. But it's just something to be considerate of and watchful for in the fine print of these very, very lengthy descriptions of how the protocols work. And then the last thing I'll say before just telling you a little bit about the California context is the consideration of how well small and medium-sized producers are going to benefit from these carbon market protocols, and also the early adopters I mentioned earlier. These are pictures of folks that we work closely with as advisors and models and spokespeople on our work, and you know, all of them are really out in front in doing a number of innovative strategies on their farms that have climate benefits. None of them would be eligible probably for selling carbon credits because they're already doing the leading edge stuff. And so they wouldn't be able to participate. And then many of them are, you know, only farming a few hundred acres. There's a couple of exceptions. A few of these guys actually have several hundred acres, close to 1,000, or in some cases several thousand acres. But most of them are smaller scale. And again, you know, it comes back to those transaction costs and the value of the actual sale, and whether it would be worth the time of the farmer to do all that paperwork and pay the middlemen, you know, between them and the sale. And there's talk about aggregating growers, but that's another role. Then you would need an aggregator, and they would have to be paid something. And then there's questions around what happens if in an aggregate pool of growers someone doesn't meet the terms of the contract. What happens then? Who pays? So typically the answer so far has been that some insurance pool would be formed out of the group, out of the income of that group, and set aside for either an unforeseen or an intentional violation of a contract. But that again lowers the price return to the farmers. So a lot of really big and challenging questions for the folks that were interested in engaging in climate solutions. I'm just going to say a little bit about California's program. So California is 2 years into, 2 or 3, depending on how you count it, into the implementation of a cap and trade program, and only this year, starting in January, has the program been fully implemented with all of the biggest emitters coming under the cap, and only in the current budget year we're in is some money starting to move out of a public source of funding that the cap and trade program creates. So what the California program did in its design, which not all cap and trade programs do, is it created this mandatory carbon market, but it also created something called a greenhouse gas reduction fund, which is under public control. It's monies that are under the authority of the governor and the legislature to disperse. So, so backing up just a little bit, we do have a mandatory carbon market with caps on the biggest emitters in the utility sector, in industrial sources, and also in transportation fuels. So far, there are only 2 agriculture protocols on the table. As I said, one that incentivizes anaerobic digesters on CAFOs. The other has been nearing approval for a year. I feel like every time I hear there's a meeting of the Air Resources Board, actually there's one tomorrow, I think they're taking up this rice protocol yet again. It's been very, very difficult to get it passed. What the rice protocol does is it would pay growers to do one or both of 2 practices, change one or both of these practices. In California, we flood irrigate our rice. So it would pay growers to either drain those flooded fields a little bit early each year, earlier than they otherwise would, and or secondly, that they would agree to do dry seeding of the rice instead of seed the rice on a flooded field. And the reason behind both of those practices is that the methane that comes off the rice fields is the result of the anaerobic decomposition underneath the water of the rice, the residue on the rice fields that biodegrades and then lets off methane. It's quite a big source of methane, actually. So having less flooded fields for less of the year would theoretically at least reduce the methane emissions. However, that hasn't been approved yet, and even if it is, there's a lot of skepticism in the rice industry that it'll be worth anybody's time to participate. So very briefly, California program also created this public fund, and all the biggest emitters are required to buy permits on this public auction place. We've accrued $872 million, so for the current budget year we're in, the amount of money is expected to go up to more than $2 billion this year. It's going to grow every year, and the money has to be spent making investments in voluntary actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you'll see here in this current budget year, that's a breakdown of how the money was allocated for this year, and looking ahead, CalCan is hoping that and advocating for the numbers that you see here under 2015-16, that we'll be able to see some money for permanent protection of farmland with conservation easements, ongoing water conservation in the face of the drought, and then what we are pushing forward with the bill is to incentivize and pay for, through a competitive grants program, some on-farm demonstration projects that have climate benefits, and we think that program has a lot better chance of serving the needs of some of the growers that we work with, in contrast to the carbon market. So I'm going to wrap up because I think I've gone a little bit over time, and leave the rest for questions at the end. Thanks so much for your time and for your thoughtful questions about this issue.
All right, thank you, Renata. So our next presentation is going to be from Ben Lilliston, and he will be talking about international markets. And just a reminder, if everyone can be sure to send in their questions through the chat, that way we can have a nice discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, this is Ben Lilliston. Thanks for the introduction, and it's great to be on this webinar, and thanks for this that great presentation from Renata. I think that really, you could sort of take a lot of those concerns that she outlined around carbon markets and agriculture and translate that internationally, because there's a lot of crossover. And so the good news is that'll let me get through this presentation maybe a little quicker, and we can get to more questions. So I work at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and we've been around since the mid-'80s, and really have always focused on how international institutions, trade agreements impact farmers on the ground. And I'd say probably the last 7 or 8 years leading up to the Copenhagen UN climate talks, we really started to dig into carbon markets, how they impact farmers, how they impact food security. So that's where we're coming from, and we share somewhat of a healthy skepticism of carbon markets as they can work for farmers, and as they work to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Just a really quick history, Kyoto Protocol in '97, what it did was, aside from countries committing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it set up international emissions trading, just different tools to help countries meet those emission targets. So international emissions trading associated with a global carbon market. It set up something called the Clean Development Mechanism, which runs through the World Bank, which sets up offset credits in developing countries, and the idea is that developed countries would purchase offset credits in developing countries as a way to sort of move money from developed countries to developing countries around climate change. And so the World Bank, through the CDM, sets up a lot of different types of offset projects. And then the joint implementation is really about trading credits between developed countries. And that's used much less than the CDM. But one of the challenges that is really come forward around in the international context is they haven't been able to sort of follow up on Kyoto and pass a treaty with binding obligations in order to fully establish a global carbon market. So they've been stuck on that. I'm sure most of you are aware of that. And so even as we enter the climate talks right now and going into Paris, where they'll finish this latest round of negotiations in December, they're not going to reach binding commitments from each country. They're going to be non-binding. They're going to be you know, people sort of based on peer pressure, you know, what do you want to commit and how are you going to do it? And so the result of that approach at the international level is that you've seen this proliferation of carbon markets around the world, sort of a bottom-up carbon market being created. So they're happening at states, regions, and some countries like China have multiple carbon markets. Of course, the U.S. has multiple carbon markets. So this is from the World Bank and kind of gives you an idea of when they've started. The idea is still, for many of these carbon market developers, is to connect to a global market ultimately, with the hope that that one will be created, but also to think about how to connect these existing carbon markets, these regional local ones, together. So you see, you know, provinces in Canada thinking about how to join the California carbon market, and other explorations along those lines. And you can also see how relatively new they are. So we know some things about them, but it's difficult to fully assess their effectiveness. Thus far, the European trading scheme is one that's been around for the longest, and we have the most information, and what we know is quite troubling about the effectiveness of carbon markets. So this slide kind of goes through how carbon markets are different. This identifies how each carbon market covers different sectors. So there's obviously a lot of crossover here, but it's also different. And I think that's worth pointing out, is that how you set up the carbon market really matters. The number of allowances that you give off to polluters at the beginning matters. How you do offset credits, whether you include agriculture or not, whether offset credits are allowed within the outside of the geographic region of the carbon market, so international offsets, who sets the price for carbon. There's a whole series of factors about how you set up a carbon market that can have important implications for its effectiveness, whether it works, and how it affects agriculture. Internationally, agriculture also is often also connected with forestry and thought of as sort of land-based offsets. But it's important to kind of recognize that some carbon markets don't have land-based offsets, and some of them restrict the amount that you can get outside of the carbon market and have all other sorts of variables. So it's hard to make one determination about how a carbon market, how effective one is, or what one works, or how it works. So we've already kind of gone through this. I'm not going to spend too much time, but these are the sort of international offsets that are most common. And I would say, you know, renewable energy, energy efficiency, these are the most common offsets. Agriculture and forestry are very rare, and that goes to a lot of the points that Renata made, and I'll get into really briefly, but just the lack of reliability and integrity of these land-based offsets, and the difficulties for farmers to really be a part of that, and for it to work for farmers, are reasons that those other types of offsets have been much more widely implemented. And the other thing is, you know, this idea of comparing sort of pollution out of a coal plant and energy efficiency, that's one thing where you can sort of measure metric tons of and compare in almost a one-to-one type of basis. But comparing carbon sequestration on a farm or in a forestry in a natural environment with all these different variables is much more difficult, and that's why most of the offset markets have sort of gravitated in this direction. So these are some of the critiques of the carbon market so far as they've been implemented, and the concerns that people have had. And the most basic one is this issue of price. What is the price of carbon within that market? And at a fundamental level, is it high enough in order to spur industry to change, polluters to change their behavior and reduce pollution? You know, so that's part of the real goal, right, to put a price on carbon. So this is just a chart of the European Union emissions trading scheme price, and there you see a bunch of different problems, right? One, you see price actually declining, you see the volatility in the price, and then you see it below $5. And what the price should be is I think Renata mentioned, very debatable. among economists and so forth. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates $50 per metric ton. So we're nowhere near close here in Europe, and this is something that they're trying to fix right now is how do we deal with this? What they did, they put too many allowances out on the market, too many offset credits. It kind of flooded the market, and prices just went all over the place and down. But it's not just Europe that's dealing with this issue. As Renata mentioned, California's price is around 11. China prices are still not much over 13. So in the RGGI carbon market in the Northeast U.S. is well below California's. So we're not close to that price in terms of changing polluters' behavior. And then this gets to another point that Renata made, which is what is the right price for farmers to engage in this? What makes sense for them? At what point do they say, I'm going to do something different? Because as she pointed out, it has to be additional practices. It can't be what you were already doing. You need to take further steps around sequestration. And so this is numbers behind a particular project that the World Bank trotted out several years ago as one of the first carbon sequestration projects with farmers called the Kenya Agricultural Carbon Project. And we dug into that and really looked at the numbers, and you're dealing with, in this case, 60,000 farmers, 45,000 hectares, rolled out over 9 years, 20-year project. A lot of good practices promoted, a lot of sustainable agriculture practices, so it's not as if the project itself wasn't valuable, but at the end of the day, once you took out all the transaction costs and, as Renata pointed out, the middle of the chain players, worked out to be about $23 per farmer over 20 years, so a little over $1 is what they'll be receiving as part of this project. Obviously, that's not probably enough and where it needs to go in order for this to really take hold and function the way it should. But this project, in looking into it, highlighted a couple of problems. One, the real difficulties of dealing with small-scale farmers in this type of system, the challenges, and even when you aggregate them and put them together, from a carbon offset perspective, it'd be a lot simpler to deal with fewer very big landowners. And this is how this system is kind of set up, and we're concerned that smaller size farmers are going to be kind of left out and not really included in this or benefit with it as you look at the pricing here. But the other issue was the World Bank was fairly open about the fact that they couldn't measure exactly how much carbon sequestration was going to take place during this project. They used a bunch of different estimates and guesses and assumptions and to try to come up with a number. They did come up with numbers, but fairly open admission that we don't really know, and that goes to the integrity of the credit. If you're going to operate within a market, and as Renata pointed out, if you're polluting and you're trying to offset that pollution, you need to have another credit, an offset credit that has integrity, and very difficult to assess. And even an institution like the World Bank, a very pro-carbon market offset institution, admitted they can't really calculate exactly how much is being sequestered. I think it's worth mentioning quickly fraud in the offset market. This is a fairly widespread in Europe, a big deal. Interpol has set up all kinds of guidelines to try to deal with criminal activity around offset credits. Friends of the Earth put out a really good paper several years ago about 10 ways to game the carbon market. It's not that this is happening in California, but it kind of, when you start to dig into it, you see the different ways in which this could happen. It goes to the real importance of having a strong market that is regulated, overseen, verified, all these different components, and how much energy and resources need to go into that to prevent fraud. And what they're talking about here is basically kind of rigging the baseline numbers to show that they're saving either more energy, a lot of them are around energy projects and saving more energy than they actually were, and those sort of things. But this is a big deal for the European carbon market, and it's been raised in some of the others as well. The risks of poor regulation, if these markets really take off, just to give you a little bit of background here, The International Emissions Trading Association is really active globally around the formation of carbon markets, really pushing for this international market. And who's in that? It's important to remind ourselves, the big banks, the oil and energy industry and agribusiness companies, Cargill and so forth. What they want out of these markets is really to make money. They're focused on how do we game these systems, these markets, in order to profit. The climate impacts, or the impacts on, or how they impact farmers or food security, are really not on the table for them. And this is a concern primarily because of what we've seen in financial regulation around our existing commodity markets, where there's been widespread speculation, excessive speculation on those markets that contributed to the global financial crisis. They're still not well regulated. You got a lot of these same players interested in carbon markets, ready to get involved once they get in place. Now, a lot of these players have sort of pulled back a little bit because of the problems with the European trading scheme, but they're ready, and they're ready to engage once the money starts to be there for them, and that's a concern, I think, for anyone who has been following commodity market speculation. Real quickly, this concept of offshoring pollution and leakage has been a big issue of concern internationally. And what this means is basically, you know, if you are polluting with a carbon market, you move your operation somewhere else and continue to pollute in your manufacturing facility, but you export into that market. So you've basically just offshored it. And this comes up a lot in the context of China, where they are now the world's largest polluter, but a lot of estimates are somewhere around 50% of their pollution may be associated with exports, and certainly a chunk of that coming to the United States. So we've moved manufacturing offshore, but the global climate doesn't really care where it's coming from. It's still polluting. Our numbers may show up better, but the problem persists, and carbon markets don't deal with this very well. I'm not going to go into this too much because Renata just went into it, and these same issues exist globally and internationally. So it's not, these are scientific questions, but there are also questions for farmers. You know, this additionality, as she said, doing stuff beyond what you're doing, and the permanence issue, big deal, right? How many years are the contracts? What are you locking a farmer into? When we know farmers have to make decisions very often year to year, dealing with economics, and some practices around farming, whether it's tilling, even light tilling, can release carbon. Sometimes you need to do that, or plant different crops and so forth. So this is a major concern among the ag community globally. And then also to reiterate what Renata pointed out, which is that viewing agriculture only as carbon is problematic. And in the international sense, a lot of the emergence around carbon markets also coincided with huge increases in the price of food around the world, and the connection to hunger. Climate change, we know, is hitting many countries who are dealing with hunger. And so food security is very important, and food security, most experts believe, empowering farmers, empowering countries to set their own food system are really critical to dealing with food security challenges. And when you view agriculture and food only as carbon, then that's all you're thinking about. And it can set up some very strange incentives in agriculture. For example, farmers may decide if they just want to grow trees in order to get carbon credits, if carbon credits ever actually made financial sense for a farmer. And we've seen a little bit of that in Brazil, where there's been tree plantations associated with carbon offsets put in place. And then to put it in a larger context, a major concern internationally continues to be outside investors owning farmland. And this is a concern in the U.S. as well. It's also called land grabs internationally. But outside investors, of course, don't have the same interests as farmers and people dealing with food challenges. And if they are looking to take advantage of a carbon market, they may treat the land in a way that doesn't serve all the other functions of agriculture that we need agriculture to serve. So this is a very also common critique of carbon markets internationally. I wanted to just point out quickly, there are other things on the table about how to deal with agriculture internationally, even at the at the UN climate talks. They have something called the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund, both kind of go towards different types of agriculture. Green Climate Fund focused towards developing countries and agriculture potentially that function a little bit more like a traditional public money or public resources. I think what's been less explored and might be something for NSAC to think about is how other types of climate policy could benefit the type of agriculture that we want. So is there a way that a carbon tax could generate public money to support the type of agriculture we want? The cap and dividend proposal that's been out there, is there a way to gear that a little bit towards sustainable agriculture, kind of along the way that Renata pointed out, the public funds generated from the carbon market in California going towards some really good projects. So I'll end there. I put up some resources if people really want to dig into a lot of these details. These are where you can find that. And I just wanted to point out too, I just ran across today that NRCS is doing a really interesting webinar on May 21st about organic agriculture and climate change that might get to some of the scientific questions, really on the farm scientific questions about carbon sequestration that some people may have. So I'll go ahead and end there.
All right, thank you so much, Ben. Great presentation. So now we are going to switch gears onto the questions, and so if you haven't already, please feel free to type them into the chat function. Otherwise, I'm going to start with the ones we already have. And so to kick us off, I'm going to ask this question to Renata. This is from Jim. If a farmer wants to engage in new practices to be rewarded for sequestering carbon or reducing greenhouse gases, what steps does she need to go through to produce these tradable offsets?
Well, the only way a grower can participate in carbon sales of credits is to comply with an already approved protocol, either on the California market or a voluntary market elsewhere. So it's really the question is answered by looking at the terms of those protocols and evaluating whether it's worth your time and money to meet those terms. So there's no one-size-fits-all answer there, but you have to do some sleuthing around and figure out what type of system you're using and whether you're interested in changing your practices to comply, and whether you're willing to do so over a fairly long period of time.
All right. And just to clarify, did you say in California the anaerobic digester is one of two current protocols for agricultural land?
It's actually the only one, and the rice one is probably going to be approved soon.
Great. All right. A question from Jan, or really curious about a comment from either one of you. In regard to the revenue-neutral, market-based carbon fee and dividend approach advocated by the Citizens Climate Lobby, would this be an effective alternative to a carbon market that would work in the interest of agriculture?
Ben, why don't you take that one?
Okay. Well, I think always it depends, right? It depends on the details and how it's set up. Anytime you're going to raise the price of carbon and so forth, I think we need to acknowledge that farmers and rural communities are going to be particularly hit by that. They are dependent on energy in different ways, and transportation fuel and so forth. So the question is, what are you going to do with that revenue? How are you going to get it out there to mitigate some of those costs? And can you promote the kind of farming that we want? I think there's potential, but we would need to kind of see how it works. But I think I think we're going to need to be creative and to think about creative ways to get public resources focused on this. You know, another idea that's been put forth both domestically, I think, and internationally is around speculation tax or a tax, financial transaction tax, and which could generate a tremendous amount of money. And could you then guide that money towards farm and sustainable agriculture programs that we would support? We gotta get creative about this. So I think the answer is it could.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. So question from David, is there any possibility of an effort towards reorienting the conservation title of the U.S. Farm Bill to reward farmers directly rather than through carbon offset trading for sequestration? I'm aware of the Conservation Innovation Grant Program. Are there any other approaches?
And NRCS has been trying to calibrate, but qualify its existing conservation practices and identify which ones have the most benefits in terms of climate mitigation. And so they have a website where they've identified about 35 practices that have the best benefits. I don't think, and maybe actually there's probably other experts on the call who know the answer better, but I don't think they're yet to the point where they're integrating those into their decision making about which practices get funded or which you know, I don't think there's any additional incentive, but they're definitely trying to crosswalk with their existing practices. And one of the tools they're using to do that is a computer model called Comet Farm that's pretty interesting and needs a lot more calibration and a lot more examination, but it does try to take those practice standards and give the growers a computer interface where they can evaluate the effects of those various practices on climate.
All right. A question from Jeff, maybe suited better for Ben. In terms of assessments, have there been any assessments of how well these carbon markets have worked to date? And you know, how thorough, if so, have those assessments been in measuring actual change in greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, as I think one of those early slides pointed out, so many of them are so new and actually in the process of being set up, even in stages, you know, just as California is happening in different stages of development. So there's been a lot written about and critiques around the European trading scheme because it's been around the longest. There's a group called, I think I had in my resources, Carbon Market Watch, that really is sort of a watchdog of that system and published a bunch of different reports and stuff. But the others, I think, are too new right now. So, and they're also different. So the answer is not quite yet.
All right. A question from Tim. Do all markets use practice-based accounting methods, or do some use outcome-based, such as an index type of method? And if both, how do transaction costs compare?
I'm only familiar with the couple that are in play here in California, and they're both practice-based. I don't know, Ben, if you know anything more globally.
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I think that the ones I know of are practice-based, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, this is actually a kind of an important point. It relates to the difficulty of quantifying actual, you know, reductions, emissions reductions on farms. The idea of actually measuring the reductions, the actual reductions on farms has mostly been dismissed as, you know, as infeasible, I think, in most cases. So because of, you know, just the practicalities, the fluxes that are naturally occurring on a given farm over the year with different practices, with irrigation, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think that there's much serious consideration, but at least not that I've heard of actually measuring those emissions reductions or those emissions. Instead, what what it seems is that all of those protocols rely on the use of computer modeling to to extrapolate the likely outcomes of changing practices.
All right. I'd like to ask a question. It does seem like certain methodologies currently in place favor biotechnology and rather large acreage amounts. And so I was curious, in regard to CalCan's principles, with small and mid-sized producers, just simply because they have fewer acres and they have fewer flocks of animals, in what ways could the incentives be designed so that it would encourage them despite the small sum of money they would be receiving?
Well, I think our work, we're not focused at all on trying to make the carbon market work. We're watching it. We're expressing concern. We're making comment on protocols as they get developed where we think there might be dangers. Where there might be unintended consequences, or for example, protocols that might actually encourage the use of biotechnology, but we really don't think I actually don't think that the carbon market is fixable ultimately. I mean, because of those really important parameters that are embedded in it, the permanency, additionality, and the verification pieces. I just don't see it being a very useful tool in very many cases for the folks that we're representing. It might, in some cases, for the big growers, it might cause them to make some incremental changes in, say, their nitrogen fertilizer management or something like that, which I don't dismiss. That's just not where CalCan focuses or works, and not who we're representing. That's it's there, but I think so. Where we have put our energies is on this greenhouse gas reduction fund, which is under public control and influence, at least to the extent we can influence the governor and the legislature and the agencies that implement the program. So there, the opportunities are really different, and but it's still challenging. It's still really difficult, just as it would be with a cap and dividend program, to actually get guidelines that serve small and medium-sized growers. There's still a lot of the same difficulties exist. Difficult to quantify the actual reductions. Difficult to figure out how to get those smaller folks involved in a competitive grants program. But it's a program that we imagine looking more like NRCS's conservation programs than it looks like the carbon market. We sort of see it more as a complement to NRCS practices that's driven by the climate benefits, but accompanied by a whole bunch of other environmental and health co-benefits. And we think if it's, and we're actively engaged right now, in this moment, in trying to push forward a vision for what would guide that program development. If anybody really wants to dig into some of the thinking we've done around this, you can look on our website and pull up a document called Blueprint for a California Climate and Agriculture Program. And it in part will answer this question a little bit more in terms of how we think a program that's funded by public money taken from those sales of those permits in order to incentivize the smartest, the most innovative, the risk takers, and the small and medium-sized growers through a competitive grants program, and hopefully drive the stuff that they're doing into best practice over time.
All right, thank you for that response. Well, it seems that we are just about out of time today. This video, just for everyone, will be available online, as well as IATP's website and their YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us today, and thank you so much, Renata and Ben, for sharing your expertise.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a great day.